So we want to look at slavery in the Old Testament, and one of the important things that's going to be crucial for us to do is to be sure to understand it in its proper light, because we have one word, slavery, that can mean a lot of different things. Now, the first thing that we need to look at is, what are the historical causes of slavery? Where did slaves come? There are a bunch of different answers to this question, and I think they're kind of revealing in terms of giving us an understanding of historical slavery throughout the world, not just in the United States. So first of all, kind of obviously, children born to slaves were a common source of slaves. That's often why female slaves were valued more than male slaves, which is why when Pharaoh is looking to get rid of Moses, this deliverer who's just been born, he says, all right, kill all the boys, but keep the girls, because they're valuable. Why? Because they make more slaves. All right, so it's children were the first one. Now, a second one, which we don't often think of, is that they're prisoners of war. And standard practice in the ancient world was that when you fought a war against someone or someone attacked you, the winner would take the prisoners of war and they would offer them a choice. You can either be put to death right now, or you can become our slaves. And in terms of, what about other options? Well, sending them back home, well, they might just, get another sword and come back and try again. So that was seen as a bad option. Not that it never happened, but it was seen as a bad option. Some options that weren't on the table were the idea of, let's say, sending them to prison. Because in the ancient world, there are no prisons. There is no place where you send people where they have a bed and 3 square meals a day and don't really have to do anything. Because if they had those in the ancient world, everybody would have been committing crimes to go to prison, because most people had to work all day just to be able to feed themselves. So when you have that kind of an economy, the idea that you're going to put people in prison is just simply not an option. And so you resort to others. You take the risk of sending them back, and they can attack again, or you make them slaves. You make them productive workers in your fields or your industries, or you kill them. So that's why the options in the ancient world were what they are. We might consider more options today because, well, frankly, we can afford it. It would be much more difficult back then. It would be almost impossible. Now, a third option here is people selling themselves into slavery, which is something was not really a part of American slavery at all, but is pretty common in the history of the world, and it's referenced in the Old Testament, and it happens in Roman sources we know as well. So why on earth would somebody sell themselves into slavery? Well, the first reason might be that they're at the point of starvation. And so they sell themselves as a slave because when you sell yourself as a slave, you become part of a household. And when you're part of a household, you get a daily portion of food. Now you have to work all the time. Your life is no longer your own, but at least you're not starving to death. And that's why for people in really desperate situations, that was an option. It might be the case that, sort of along with that selling yourself into slavery was the only way to pay your debts. And it was with your labor because, in economies with low capital, the very poor people, they didn't have capital. They didn't have land that they could use. They didn't have large herds that they could sell. They didn't even have a lot of tools, probably. All they had was their labor. And so that's what they would use to pay their debts, by selling themselves into slavery. Again, not common in America, but historically it happened. Fourth, kidnapping. Now this is one of the big sources for American slaves. A lot of kidnapping that happened in Africa, and those slaves were then sold to European slave traders, who then sent them to the New World. A fifth source of slavery was abandoned children. So it was actually common in the ancient world, especially the ancient Roman world, that if a child was born into the family and for some reason the family didn't want it, either they had enough kids already, or they couldn't afford another one, or there was something wrong with it, the kid had a cleft palate, or, was cross-eyed, or whatever. The father of the family could choose to give away the kid. And this was very common. And actually, oftentimes people would take the child to the edge of town. They would take it to the dunghill. And they'd leave it on the dunghill, where the poop, the town poop was left to decompose. And they'd leave their kids there. And if nobody picked up the kid would die of exposure to the elements. If somebody came by and saw the baby, they could adopt it and make it their own, and then when it became older, they could sell it into slavery, or they could use it as a household slave or as a prostitute. And that also was fairly common. And finally, slavery could be a punishment for a crime. Now, it's very interesting that in the United States Constitution, according to the 13th Amendment, slavery is outlawed in the United States except as punishment for a crime. Like, this is still legal. And when you think about it, what happens if you go to prison and you have to work on, a chain gang or something like that? You have to do some kind of work detail, produce a product for the prison, whatever. What's happening? Well, you're not in control of your life. You're told when you're going to eat and when you're going to sleep and when you're going to do all these things. You're not allowed to have a normal family life. You don't decide when you're going to come and when you're going to go. And you don't get to make any money off your labor, or very, very little. Maybe you make like 20 cents an hour or something like that. And so somebody, if you zapped somebody from the ancient world and brought them to U.S. prison and saw prisoners working on something, they'd say, oh, this is slavery. Which is why the U.S. Constitution specifically allows slavery as punishment for crime, because going to prison could be seen as a form of slavery. But again, remember, historically, prisons don't exist. They don't have money for that. And they don't want to encourage people to commit crimes by promising them to send them to a place where they'll get 3 square meals a day. So prisons are not an option in the ancient world like they are in the modern world.